September has arrived on the Eastern Front, and with it the late summer rains have begun. Guderian is relentlessly driving his tanks south in a daring attempt to cut off the defenders of Kyiv. In his wake, he leaves the vulnerable Field Marshal von Bock to try to hold the line at Yelna. The Soviet High Command is willing to throw away tens of thousands of their brave soldiers to take it from him. Last week we watched the Bryansk front try to hold off Guderian as his panzers attempted to drive south and cut off Kyiv from behind. We also saw that the advance on Leningrad began to stall in front of the city, while the hooking attack from the east cut off the city from outside rail connections. This week we will cover the first week of September, as summer begins to leave the expanses of the European Soviet Union, and autumn starts to creep in around the edges of the front. We will cover September 1st through 7th, starting with a look at Army Group North and the fighting for the approaches to Leningrad. In Army Group North's area of responsibility, the drive on Leningrad was recovering from the earlier stumbling blocks. The Tutin's offensive had been brushed aside by Manstein's panzers, and the 18th Army had cleared Estonia. The Soviet forces were decimated by the rapid advances of Lieb's offensive. To combat the poor state of the field armies, the Stavka released 3 armies to help stem the German onslaught. The 54th, 52nd and 4th armies had been dispatched in the last days of August, and started to arrive in positions in front of the city in early September. They were focused on the eastern side of Volkhov to prevent a link-up between the Finns and Germans. The Germans had captured Mega in August, but an NKVD division managed to take it back a day before being forced out by the 20th Motorized. A seesaw struggle continued for the first week of September, and by the end of the week, the Germans were firmly in control. The 48th Army was struggling to hold the line, and on September 7th, the 20th Motorized and 12th Panzer Divisions took Senevino. Schisselburg was next. These towns represented the last land connections to the rest of the Soviet Union. Mega had been the last rail connection and represented a serious loss for the defense of Leningrad. When Schisselburg and Senevino fell to the Germans, there were no more alternatives. The only way to leave the city without going through Axis lines was across Lake Ladoga. Army Group North had managed to advance on average 5 kilometers a day in July, which reduced down to 2.2 kilometers a day in August, and plummeted down to 1.5 kilometers a day in September. Lengthening supply lines, ever-increasing fatigue in its soldiers, and ferocious Soviet resistance had started to take its toll on Army Group North. But now, with Leningrad isolated, many of them started to believe their work had been done. All that was left was to wait for Leningrad to starve and surrender, and for Army Group Center and South to complete their missions. The Finns had advanced across the Karelian Isthmus far enough that they posed a serious threat to Leningrad itself. They had no plans to help assault the city, but Soviet intelligence had no way of knowing that for sure. As it stood, Lieutenant General M. Popov was directed to do his best to push them back and relieve the pressure on the city. He had few available forces to accomplish this. The northern front was divided into 2 subfronts in late August. The division was effective by the 1st of September, becoming the Leningrad and Karelian fronts. This new organization did not supplant the Northwestern Front, but highlighted how the Stavka was viewing the developments in front of Leningrad. The Northwestern Front had essentially been peeled off the defense of the city. The Tutin's offensive had been a last-ditch effort to reform those lines, but it had now failed. Now the front was in the figurative and literal wilderness east of Lake Ilmen. Bock had his hands full as the month began. Timoshenko and the 3rd iteration of the Western Front were still hammering all along his lines east of Smolensk. Guderian was pressuring the staff and commander of Army Group Center to provide more men and additional support. The situation in the Yelna salient was reaching a crisis point. On the 6th of September, Hitler issued a renewed pronouncement for the campaign, the War Directive No. 35. Hitler had reversed course once again, and decided that Moscow would be taken after all. At this point, it was becoming clear to everyone involved that the war would not be ended before the end of the year. Hitler's directive did not outright admit as much, instead doing so implicitly. The aim was to end the year on a high note. If his armies could capture Moscow and Kyiv, with Leningrad under siege, Hitler could plausibly tell the German people the war was all but won. The directive outlined the campaign's objectives. The details of the operation were to be handled by Bock's staff and submitted for approval. Hitler set the hard limits on the forces available and the objectives. Once Guderian was done with his role in the destruction of the southwestern front, he would return to the fold in the center. Bock would also receive Hopner's 4th and Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group. The 1st Panzer Group would remain with Army Group South and continue his offensive actions in Ukraine, extending as far south as Crimea. The plan outlined in Hitler's directive called for a dual envelopment to crush Tymoshenko's forces. Notably, it specifically ordered that the destruction of the Western Front be done through close encirclement. The emphasis on closeness could not have been missed by Bock or Hellyer. This had been a point of disagreement earlier in the year after the initial fighting for Minsk. Indeed, a choice between closer operational encirclement and deeper strategic encirclement had been at the heart of disputes between Hitler and his field commanders since the invasion of France. Still, Bock had gotten what he wanted. The advance on Moscow would be resumed, and his command would once again become the center of gravity for the entire campaign. In the meantime, Army Group Center was still being hammered by the blows of Tymoshenko and Zhukov. Yelna was still the focus point of the Red Army, and the Wehrmacht was hanging on by a thread. Zhukov had paused his operations to regroup and receive reinforcements from the Stavka reserves. Once these were in place, he restarted his attacks. On September 1st, the entirety of Army Group Center's front lines came under assault. The Soviet 16th, 19th and 20th Armies of the Western Front attacked from Yartsevo to Dukovshin. At the salient itself, the 24th Army was the main effort, with support from the 43rd Army. Defending the salient stood only 4 German infantry divisions. The 268th, 292nd, 78th and 137th Infantry had been cobbled together from several infantry corps from the 4th and 9th Armies and sent to relieve the panzers in the salient. It was proving impossible for them to resist the weight of the numbers being thrown against them. Officers complained to their superiors that the fighting had been reduced to desperate defences of trenches, with rationing of artillery and no armour support to be found anywhere along the line. Every attack became fertile ground for a local penetration, and every penetration was potentially a breakthrough that could lead to the end of the salient's existence. Army Group Center was aware of the fraught nature of the fighting around Yelna, but could spare nothing to help relieve the pressure. Tymoshenko's Western Front offensive ensured that Bock had no reserves. The staff of Army Group Center and the 20th Infantry Corps had no solution. A retreat had to be authorized. If they delayed much longer, the Red Army might be able to exploit their success and break through across the Desna River, where they would find nothing but open space. This was obviously out of the question. On the 4th of September, Bock gave the orders for a withdrawal back across the river, saving his infantrymen from certain destruction at the hands of Zhukov's rifles. This was done in good order, and the infantry divisions made it to new positions on the western side of the Desna, where they reformed the line along the Ustrom and Stryana rivers. Yelna would be liberated on the 5th of September. Zhukov had done the seemingly impossible. He had forced back significant German forces from prepared positions. It cost the Red Army nearly 32,000 casualties and 2 strong tank divisions, but it had been accomplished. For their part, the Germans had paid dearly to hold the salient as long as they had. The fighting around Yelna from July to September cost the Wehrmacht close to 10,000 casualties. Despite this success, the Stavka was frustrated that the German forces had managed to escape intact, rather than the desired encirclement and destruction of the defenders of the salient. Guderian's drive south had encountered problems in the last week of August, as the Bryansk front was able to block Schweppenberg's Panzer Corps from pushing across the Desna River in strength. Meanwhile, the Second Army had been unable to keep up on his flank, leading Guderian to complain that his sides were exposed to counterattack. In response to these threatening assaults on his flank, Guderian would request that further mobile formations be released from Army Group Center. He received only the SS Das Reich Division and the Grossdeutschland Regiment. Army Group Center needed the rest of the panzers to contain the threat of a breakthrough by the armies of the Western and Reserve fronts. Tymoshenko and Zhukov had resumed their battering of the front lines, and Bock's men were stressed to their breaking point. On the 1st of September, Schweppenberg had managed to push the 3rd and 4th Panzer Divisions across the river. There were serious problems with his advance. Between the two divisions, he could only muster 86 operational tanks. Still, they managed to push ahead. From the 1st of September onward, both divisions were struck by Soviet counterattacks. The 21st Army, under Lieutenant General Gerasimenko, attacked the 4th Panzer around Kurup. The division was under the command of Major General Erlenkamp. They managed to take over 1,200 prisoners from the 21st Army's botched attack. The 4th Panzer under Model did not fare as well as Erlenkamp's men. The 10th Tank Division, which was a shadow of its former self, managed to hold up Model for several days. The disparity in outcomes for these minor battles is difficult to discern. However, terrain, logistics, and tactical leadership on both sides played significant roles in the results. In late August, Eremenko had been ordered personally by Stalin to smash Guderian and his group to smithereens. He did not intend to disappoint the dictator and promptly put together a plan. Guderian's northern flank was exceedingly long. It stretched well over 100 kilometers long. To guard this flank, he had assigned General of Panzers Lemelson and his 47th Corps. Eremenko decided to take advantage of Lemelson's exposed position. He put together a mobile exploitation force consisting of the 4th Cavalry Division, the 108th Tank Division, and the 141st Tank Brigade. The 17th Panzer Division, under the command of Lieutenant General Arnim, was the target. Arnim had only 50 operational tanks to cover more than 60 kilometers. To make matters worse, only about half of these were Panzer IIIs, with the rest being obsolete light models. The Soviets had more T-34s than the Germans had tanks, and KV-1s and some BT light tanks accompanied these. Eremenko began a reconnaissance in force before August ended. However, this was stopped by the Germans. German small units continued to leverage their superior organization and combined arms coordination to beat back the limited attacks on the first few days. After beating back the uncoordinated probes of Eremenko's men, they promptly went over to the offensive. By September 1st, the 108th Tank Division was surrounded in the woods. Eremenko was not keen to upset his schedule, and thus did nothing to save the division. On the morning of the 2nd, he began his own offensive. The attack stumbled, with poor reconnaissance and the now trademark Soviet failure to coordinate. On the night of the 4th of September, the 108th Tank Division managed to break out of its encirclement. They brought with them only 11 tanks and 1,200 men. The accompanying 141st Tank Brigade was also reduced to 38 tanks from the authorized strength of 94 tanks. This was a disaster. Eremenko continued his assault, but by now it was little more than localized attacks at the small unit level. The continued inability of the Red Army to properly coordinate its subordinate units meant that Lemelson was more than capable of repulsing Eremenko's attacks. By the end of the first week, the scope of the disaster was becoming clearer. On the 5th, Eremenko would request and receive permission to use blocking detachments to prevent unauthorized retreats in a desperate attempt to stabilize his crumbling command. The botched offensive had somehow managed to cost 100,000 casualties and had nothing to show for it. The 47th Panzer Corps had been stretched, but not broken. Lemelson had managed the battle well and kept his forces balanced enough to protect the flank of Guderian's advance. Nevertheless, if Stalin had not constantly outright forbidden the withdrawal of the Soviet Southwestern Front, it is plausible that Eremenko's offensive might have bought sufficient time for Kipinos to withdraw the majority of his forces to safety. Around Kyiv, a combination of bad terrain, growing logistical issues, and stiff enemy resistance was starting to make Rundstedt fear that Red Army forces ahead of him would be able to escape from the looming encirclement promised by Guderian's turn south. To this end, he demanded that the 1st Panzer Group, along with the 6th and 17th Armies, cross the Dnipro in as many sectors as possible, regardless of the condition of these formations. A bridgehead of sufficient depth would be formed at Kremenchuk, giving the Germans a starting position for an offensive towards Kyiv. This was despite the intense counterattacks from the overstretched 38th Army. One of the largest of these counterattacks was conducted by 80 Soviet tanks, although this was repulsed, with 60 tanks destroyed. Constant air interdiction by the Luftwaffe and all Soviet reserves in the local theatre being drawn towards Guderian's drive south helped prevent any larger offensives against the bridgehead. By the 7th of September, the infantry of the 17th Army had managed to expand the bridgehead sufficiently to allow for further large-scale operations. Initially, it was planned for the 1st Panzer to secure the flanks of the offensive by taking Poltava, and the 17th Army was to attack towards Mirgorod and Lubny. There they would link up with Guderian and thus form a large pocket centered on Kyiv. Increasing Soviet resistance, along with the realization that the river line was being strongly held, convinced Rundstedt that any breakout had to be completed rapidly or risk being bogged down. This would allow the Red Army more time to escape. As a result, the orders of the 1st Panzer and 17th Army were swapped. Despite the urgency for starting the operation, the offensive would be delayed due to problems with building up sufficient supplies and the reinforcement of the bridges to make them suitable for the vehicles of the panzer divisions. This includes the construction of two 16-ton bridges. Further south at Dnipropetrovsk, the 3rd Motorized Corps would again attempt to expand their bridgehead. Initially captured in late August, the 3rd had failed to expand it sufficiently to allow for the crossing of further formations. This was in part due to the entire corps being supplied by only a single footbridge and a captured floating bridge, which heavily restricted logistics, further exacerbating the normal problem of getting supplies so far east. This was worsened even more by Dnipropetrovsk being considered secondary to the efforts of the 1st Panzer and 17th Army. The other major factor was the constant assaults from the Red Army forces, who disagreed about this sector being a sideshow. A German army meeting of senior figures from Army Group South, held on the 8th, helps reveal the intensity of the fighting in this sector for the period covered by this video. It would be reported that the floating bridge would be destroyed 10 times by artillery, 3 times by bombers, once by a shot-down plane crashing into it, and lastly by a storm. Heavy tank-led assaults were frequent, with one even managing to overrun forward positions of the 198th Infantry Division. This incident resulted in heavy German casualties, with one company of the 308th Regiment being reduced to 20 men. Furthermore, VVS operations were frequent in this area, with dozens of significant air attacks being recorded. The fierce fighting at Dnipropetrovsk averaged more than 300 German casualties every single day of the battle. These heavy losses prompted the Corps commander, Zeitler, to repeatedly request permission to withdraw to the German-controlled side of the river. This was always denied by Rundstedt, who himself was under orders from Halder to hold the bridgehead. It is unclear whether the bridgehead was intended as a potential second breakout position, or as a distraction for the Soviet forces. At the end of the first week of September, the double envelopment of the southwestern front was going poorly. Guderian had limited access as he pushed south. His long flanks were lengthening, he was receiving little support from Army Group Center, and Eremenko's unsuccessful but unrelenting attacks were a constant source of distraction. In the south, Strupnagel's 17th had pushed through the first layer of the containment at Kremenchuk. However, the 38th Army was stiffening its resistance and proving to be less than easy prey for the worn-out infantry. To make matters worse, the rain had started. Curzio Malaparte wrote back to the papers in Italy, "All of a sudden, it starts to rain. At first, it is a gentle shower, silent and almost furtive. But soon it develops into a regular hurricane, a veritable cloudburst. The German soldiers look up at the sky, shouting and cursing. The artillery trains come to an abrupt halt. The horses slither about in the mud that has formed as if by magic. The lorries skid on the slippery surface." Unlike the summer rains, these were not gone in a day. It rained nearly non-stop for the first 2 weeks of September in Ukraine. Movement became all but impossible. In places along Guderian's advance, it was reported to take 10 hours to move 20 kilometers. This was intolerable, yet it had to be endured. The advance continued throughout the first week of September. The rain worked against both sides as they attempted to maneuver and supply their forward elements. While the events mentioned above are some of the major events occurring at this time, it is worth remembering that thousands of small, nameless battles were also taking place across the front. These battles would nearly always prove costly to the Red Army. Still, the sheer attrition was also impacting German forces. Some divisions were starting to dissolve battalions to bring their other battalions back up to fighting strength. Lightning-fast mobile warfare was being replaced by slow positional warfare, or even static trench fighting, reminiscent of the First World War. Already, German soldiers in these more static areas started to complain about being on the receiving end of large artillery barrages. If this trend continued, the technical superiority and mobility of the Germans might wane in importance to the demographic and industrial advantages of the Soviet Union. This concludes our discussion for this week. Next week, we will continue the week-by-week account of the entire war on the Eastern Front. From July 1941 to May of 1945, we will track the war's progress. Stay tuned, and remember, this is just the beginning of the weekly Eastern Front of World War II series. Don't forget to subscribe, comment and share this video, it helps immensely. We have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.